In stark contrast to Superman Returns, Man of Steel takes a big swing in attempting to break the mold and move away from Richard Donner's Superman the movie. While there are certainly questionable choices made, the film succeeds in its goal and effectively defines Superman for a whole generation. Let me know down in the comments what you think of Man of Steel. I'm Brennan Sem for the New Wave Nerds. Subscribe down below for more nerd content and commentary. Now let's roll the intro. An alien child is evacuated from his dying world and sent to Earth to live among humans. His peace is threatened when other survivors of his home planet invade Earth. The film is directed by Zack Snyder and written by David S. Goyer, with story by David Goyer and Christopher Nolan. The film stars Henry Cavill, Amy Adams, Michael Shannon, and Russel Crowe. Now, as always, we're going to begin with a brief non-spoiler review. At the outset here, I do want to address my biases. There's a lot of nostalgia that comes along with this movie for me. It was the first Superman movie that I had seen in theaters. I was 11 years old when it came out, and this is the beginning of my love for Superman. Now, after the movie came out, I wasn't quite at the place where I am now. I still questioned his viability as a hero, considering he is, in many iterations, nigh omnipotent and ultimately powerful. But I think that the movie does a good job of, modernizing the origin of Superman. It's a very different take than what we see in the movies preceding this. It's a very different take from what we see in many comics from like the Silver Age, when Superman really became popular, and from a lot of the more modern stuff. This is taking inspiration from a very specific time in comic book history, and I think that you can definitely feel it. I think this movie is much maligned and deserves some of the hate that it gets, but not all of it. There are really, really, really good things about this movie. There are things in this movie that you see here and have not, and likely will not see in many other superhero movies. I think it's very unique in some good ways and in some bad ways. But I do think, what are we at? Almost, 2013? We're 12 years from this movie now. We've just passed a decade not that long ago. I still think the movie holds up. Again, it is a very different stylized take, but I do think that it is very, very good. And that's, again, taking into account some of the problems that I do have with the movie. There are certainly aspects that I'm not a fan of. It is by no definition a perfect movie, but I do think it was good for the time. And again, considering the fact that it is a new take on the Man of Steel, I think it gets extra points for that. Now, before we get into the spoiler section, I'm going to very politely ask you all to head on over to patreon.com/newwavenerds. If you enjoy what we do here, if you enjoy the videos and want to help us make these look even better, then that is the place to go. We've got lots of different benefit tiers, each with their own different set of perks, so you get some value back for helping us keep the lights on. And we're doing a very special patron drive, where if we get 15 new patrons or hit $50 a month, which just about covers some of our fees to be able to do this, then we're going to release a very special 12-part video docu-series where we look at DC's Crisis on Infinite Earths. We're going to go through it issue by issue. It's going to be at least a minimum of 12 hours of content there, at least 12. Probably a little bit more if we're going to be honest, because Shade and I are certainly very long-winded, and we've got some extra bonus episodes that are probably going to come out after we finish going through the series. So again, if you like what we do here and want to help us make these even better, then go to patreon.com/newwavenerds. Now, let's get into the spoiler section. We're going to begin at Chapter 1, The Cast of Steel. If we're going to talk about the cast here, I think we obviously have to talk about the leading man himself, Henry Cavill, as Clark Kent or Superman. I think Henry Cavill is a really great pick for Superman, and I do think that he is good as Clark Kent, even though we don't necessarily see him all that much. For all intents and purposes, this movie is a Superman movie and not a Clark Kent movie. There are clearly moments where Clark shines through when he's having intimate interactions with his mom, when he is talking with the priest. But by and large, this is certainly a Superman movie. This is the one that really de-emphasizes Clark Kent. And again, in some ways that is to its benefit, and in some ways that is certainly to its detriment. But Henry Cavill, I think, is really strong here. He is a great Man of Steel, and I would have liked to have seen what he could have done in a future movie in a Man of Steel 2, which would theoretically focus a lot more on some of the more emotional beats based on, the ending and the impacts of this story and things like Justice League and so on and so forth. I think Henry Cavill is great. I do love him. Again, he's not necessarily the perfect Superman. I think he could have done better if the movie itself had been better made and better written. But he does shine in this role. He's a comic book Clark Kent, or comic book Superman who has leaped off the page. I mean, obviously he has the physique. I think he does a really good job of being confident in himself and knowing who he is, what he wants, what he needs, and all of this. I think he is very, very good. And it is a bit of a shame that we didn't necessarily get to see more of him, but of course I understand, considering the way that that franchise sort of went after these movies. But he is very, very good. Now, we also have to talk about Amy Adams as Lois Lane, who knocks it out of the park. As far as the movies go, this is by far the most confident and competent Lois Lane that we have ever had. On the big screen, this is the only interpretation of her, by my recollection at least, that is actually like a hard-nosed investigative reporter, which is what she is in the comics. Not only is she willing to go into conflicts and war zones, which we obviously know Lois does in the comics, she is very fearless, but she is also really accomplished. She's a great investigator. I mean, we're barely an hour into the movie, and Lois Lane shows up at the Kent farm being like, I need to talk about your son. She is incredibly competent. Again, as far as the movies go, this is the best Lois Lane that we've had. Amy Adams is great. She knocks it out of the park, and the characterization of her in the movie is fantastic. Now, I'm not going to say that she is the best Lois Lane that we have ever had, because there are some that I haven't seen. I know that a lot of people really enjoy the Lois Lane in Smallville, but I never got that far. I know people enjoy Lois Lane in Superman and Lois, but I didn't watch that because I had fallen off the CW by the time that series aired. So I don't necessarily know about those. But as far as the live action interpretations, especially in the movies, Amy Adams is certainly the best that we have had. Now let's talk about the antagonist here, Michael Shannon as General Zod. I think, Michael Shannon is really good. He's a tremendous actor. I think he's got some really, really good moments in this movie, but there are certainly some deliveries that are odd and awkward, and I think that is due to like the direction, specifically in the beginning. And I guess I can't quite tell if that is a choice straight from Snyder or if that is a choice that he's making to sort of homage to the scene that we get from, is it Terrace Stamp in Superman the movie? I believe it is, but in Superman the movie, he's like, I will come for your heirs or something along those lines. And in this, he has a similar line that is delivered very, very forcefully, I'll say. And there are times when it does make me laugh, I'm not going to lie. It is Terrace Stamp in Superman the movie. I thought so. But by and large, I do think Michael Shannon is really good as Zod. I think he is a really, really interesting villain. But that's all I'm going to talk about him for now, because I'm going to save that a little bit for a later section. Now, finally in the cast, the last person I want to address is Russel Crowe as Jor-El. Now, this leads us into our second chapter, The Doomed Planet. Okay, so right at the outset, I do want to say here that, I mean, Russel Crowe is a great actor. My dad and I have talked about this on a My Father Before Me when we reviewed Virtuosity quite a while ago. Russel Crowe is great. He's really a tremendous actor. I don't like him in this movie. I don't. I would like to see a version of this movie where 90% of the Jor-El scenes are just completely cut out. I don't think he necessarily adds much. I think his performance is kind of stunted, and it's just very, very weird, especially in the beginning. When I was younger, I really liked this. I liked this scene, but now as I've grown older, I've really soured on it. I do not need to see 20 minutes of an action-packed set piece of Krypton exploding. I don't need it. I don't need it. I feel like it doesn't really add all that much to the story. Now, I get that in this opening, like I said, 20 minutes, you do set up the main villain, you set up Zod, you set up the conflict with the Codex, all of this. You set up the rivalry between Jor-El and Zod, which is going to play out further in the movie. It's not needed, I don't think. I really don't think you do. I think it's just over the top, and I think it is, to me, it is a choice that is made because Snyder was like, all right, so in the opening 20 minutes, we really need to set this movie apart from all of the other Superman movies that we have seen thus far, which as a choice, I respect. I understand why you do it. I get from a branding and marketing perspective, it's a good idea, but I don't think it adds anything to the story. And so because of that, I feel like it really just adds bloat. I feel like all of the things that get seeded in this opening 20 minutes could have been dispersed throughout different parts of the film, and the story would not have really hurt. It wouldn't have been hurt, in my opinion. And to, hit some of that a little further home, this is a personal note. And it's a very nitpicky thing, and so take it as you will. Many people, myself included, would argue that this is probably not the most important thing to bear down on. But personally, I don't like the fact that it is Zod who kills Jor-El. I don't like that. Again, I understand why you do it narratively. It builds up the tension between Kal-El and Zod. I think it sort of deepens the emotional impact, maybe. But I don't think that it's needed. I really don't. I like the idea that Jor-El sends Kal-El away and then just dies in the explosion of Krypton. That's the version of the story that I like. I don't like the fact that it is a human person, or a Kryptonian person, I guess, that takes down Jor-El. I much more like the idea thematically and narratively that he's killed by the planet itself. I think it's much cleaner. But again, I understand why, from a movie-making perspective, I would understand why you would have Zod be the person who kills Jor-El. But narratively, I just really, really don't like it. And again, maybe that's just maybe that's just partly because I really don't like seeing Russel Crowe throughout this movie. I think there are lots of parts where it's pointless. I could see, to me, this strikes as the kind of thing where it's like, okay, we need somebody who is a pretty big name to play Jor-El, because obviously, we got Marlon Brando in the past, so we need somebody who is a big name. And we went for Russel Crowe, but he didn't really want to do it, and so we added these scenes to sort of entice him into doing the film. That's what it strikes me as, and because of that, I feel like it doesn't necessarily work for the story. The moment where I was very specifically like, okay, Russel Crowe does not need to be in this movie, the moment that I decided I would be interested in seeing a cut where he is not in the movie, like barely at all, is when Superman surrenders himself to General Zod, and they take him and Lois Lane up to their ship. Lois Lane puts the, what do they call it? I don't know. The little key with the Superman emblem. It's something key. Maybe it's like the code key or something like that. I don't know. But she puts the thing into the ship, and that activates, or rather that implants Jor-El, this AI, into the Kryptonian ship's mainframe or whatever. And he's running around helping Lois Lane. There's a thing there, which I think is so dumb, where they're running down the halls and the AI is like opening and closing doors to lead Lois and to stop the bad Kryptonians from attacking. And he's like pulling down doors and stuff. And he uses his hand. He like uses his hand to motion that the door is closing. Why does he do that? He's an AI. Like, this thing is a hologram. Like, the motion with his hand is not the thing that is closing the door. It's not like he is a real living person who has telepathy or technopathy or whatever. He's a program that is inside the ship itself. It's dumb, especially now. If they hadn't addressed it, then it would be one thing. Like, okay, I understand. Again, a movie is a visual thing. You have to show the audience that this is what's happening. This is why the doors are opening or closing. But there's a line where Lois Lane, like, a door closes and she looks back and is like, "Was that you?" And he's like, "Yes." Why do we need the hand motion then? It's just stupid. It's dumb. I don't like it. It's weird. It took me out of it because, again, I was like, this is a program. Again, he's not a real person. He's built into the walls. He's inside the entire mainframe. It was just weird. It was a weird choice, and I don't like it. And again, Russel Crowe's a great actor. I really wish that he wasn't in this movie quite so much. Which sucks to say because, again, he's great and I like him in a lot of things, but definitely not this, unfortunately. But we're talking about Kryptonians, so now I think it's time to head into our third chapter, Kneel Before Zod. Okay, so I mentioned earlier when we were talking about the cast of Steel that I wanted to talk a little bit more about General Zod, about Michael Shannon here. I think that, Zod is a good choice for a villain. He makes sense, again, thematically. You're hitting on the fact that Superman is an alien. You really, really want to emphasize that. And it makes for a great action movie. It makes for a good fight. Having these two Olympic-powered beings fight each other in the middle of Metropolis, I think is a really strong visual and a really good sign. And it brings out the humanity of Clark, the fact that he loves this place so much, and it does it in an interesting way. I think Michael Shannon could have maybe used a little bit more development throughout the movie. I feel like all of the development for him sort of happens in bursts. Like the best scene with him at the end, or the best scene with him in the movie is at the end, where I think this must be after the world engine has been destroyed and it looks like the heroes have won, and Zod emerges from the rubble and he's talking to Clark, or Superman, I guess, and he says, I was bred for one purpose, and that is the safety and security of Krypton. And I failed because I was put in the Phantom Zone. I failed because they didn't like what I was doing. While I was gone, the planet was destroyed. And then I come back and I have a chance to save the planet. I have a chance to bring Krypton back, and you are stopping me. I think that that's a really, really powerful moment. Obviously, that's paraphrased. That's paraphrased if you couldn't tell. But that is such a strong and powerful moment. And again, it's so powerful because, again, it's a look at it's a look inside of General Zod's mind, like why he's doing this thing. And it calls back to something that we had seen earlier, when we see the actual birth of Superman, the birth of Kal-El, which is the opening scene of the movie, and then we get the breakdown when Clark finally meets up with the quote-unquote ghost of Jor-El, and Jor-El tells him that in Krypton, all births are, genetically created, all children are genetically created to fulfill a specified purpose, right? And Kal-El, is the first natural birth on Krypton in, I think he says centuries. I don't necessarily quite remember the exact time frame, but it is the first natural birth. He is the first one who can choose what and who he wants to be. And again, I think that is interesting because you put him against Zod, who has no choice in what he wants to do, in what he has to do, in quotes. I think it's really, really interesting, and it's something that I would have liked to have seen hit a little more. It's something that I think a better movie would have spent a little bit more time building up Zod and making him like this actual dynamic character. Which again, he's only dynamic for a couple of moments. And again, that's not Michael Shannon's fault. Michael Shannon is great here. He's doing good work with what he's got. I just think that the actual story and script here are maybe a little lackluster as far as he goes. But again, I think he's great. I would have liked to have seen more of him, but not in the Flash movie. I don't know. I think the Kryptonians, by and large, are fun in this movie. I think it's really interesting. And, it's good to see Zod in opposition to Superman because, again, this is a different version of Superman than we have seen before. This is, a big action set piece. This is something that you couldn't have done 10 decades before this. This is something that you really couldn't have done by the time that we had seen the first appearance of Zod in Superman 1 and Superman 2. I think if this movie had written him a little better, then I think that it could have been the beginning of Zod as a true great member of Superman's rogues gallery. I feel like we could have gotten some really good comic stories from him if the movie had hit him home a little bit better. Because here's the thing is that in the comics, up until recently, Zod really isn't that much of an interesting character. Like, he's got some good stories here and there, but again, he's kind of flat. He doesn't have the same depth that like a Lex or a Brainiac or even Bizarro or a Mr. Mxyzptlk have. I think I'm pronouncing that right. I don't know. But in any case, I think he really could have been a true great member of the Rogues Gallery, but little stunted. But now I do want to talk about Superman himself. I've alluded to a couple different times that this is a very, very different version of Superman, and now it's time to head into our fourth and final chapter, The Dark Age. The main complaint that I hear people say about this movie is that it doesn't necessarily feel like Superman. It is dark and gritty, and it is very different from Christopher Reeve. But that is the point, right? That is the point. Now, you cannot like that, and that's fine, but I do think you have to give props to Zack Snyder for trying to take this in a different direction, trying to break away from the mold that Richard Donner had set in place. Superman Returns was in the same vein as Richard Donner and didn't do that well. People don't really like it. So the first time back after that, I think it is a smart decision to try and make it a different character, a different version of Superman from a different age. The Christopher Reeve Superman, the Brandon Routh Superman are very, very Silver Agey, which is, this time period in comics. It's from 56 to about 1970. This is when DC Comics really went into a sort of fantastical sci-fi land. This is an era of crazy, crazy stories. It's the beginning of when Superman became the big blue Boy Scout, right? That's the Silver Age. That's Christopher Reeve. That's Brandon Routh, right? Then we get to Zack Snyder and we get to Henry Cavill, and it's a very, very different take on Superman. I've heard some people say that it's much closer to the golden age of Superman, which I do see some similarities. In the golden age comics, he's much more direct and down to earth and gritty, but most of his villains are just everyday humans. They are corrupt politicians, they are mob bosses, they are whatever, corrupt business owners, etc., etc. In that sense, in the sense of the down-to-earth gritty tone, Henry Cavill is very golden agey. But by nature of the fact that the main villain of this story is a Kryptonian, I don't think it's quite accurate to say that it is golden age Superman. I think you have to go with something a little bit later. The Silver Age is very famous for bringing over 1,000,001 Kryptonians, and they didn't necessarily go away after that. So Man of Steel is much closer to Superman in the Dark Age of comics. This is a time period that begins post-Crisis on Infinite Earths, so this is from about 1986 to, I would argue, probably... I've heard different time periods. It's tough to tell. These are not set in stone. These are basically crowdsourced categories, so they are by no definition perfect or necessarily empirical. I've heard some people say that the Dark Age ends in 2000 with the beginning of like the X-Men movie, which is when they started to become a little bit more commercial. Because of that same reason, I've heard some people say 2008. And I've heard some people say 2011, because in 2011 is when we get the New 52, which is a very different time for comic books. From 2011 until now, I would say we are probably in the digital age of comic books. So just for the sake of argument, we're going to call the Dark Age from 1986 to 2011, though there's certainly an argument that could be made that could be broken up in two. But the Dark Age, as the name would suggest, is categorized by having these darker, grittier, more stories. I mean, this is the time period when we get Watchmen, when we get Dark Knight Returns. This is when we get the death of Superman. This is when we get Parallax Hal Jordan, where he kills the entire Green Lantern Corps. This is when we get things... what's another example? I can't remember. Another one that comes out in this time period is the Last Son of Krypton story, which is one of the major inspirations for this movie. It is a comic that is all about General Zod being a villain, coming to Earth to try and make it into a new Krypton. Sound familiar? Perhaps. It's very similar. There are other added elements and la-di-da, but this is Superman the Dark Age. Again, this is Zack Snyder trying to make a different movie from what we saw in Christopher Reeve, what we saw in Brandon Routh. He's making a very, very distinct choice. Now, you cannot like that, and I respect that. It's not for everybody. Again, the movie's very nostalgic, but even in that regard, I have vacillated back and forth. But if you're going to come to this movie and say that this isn't Superman, if you're going to come to this movie and say that this isn't true to the character, then you're just wrong. You're just wrong. Again, you cannot like this version of the character, but it does draw inspiration from a time period in the comics. It's not like Zack Snyder just whipped this out of his brain whole cloth. He took inspiration from this very, very specific period. Now, again, a lot of this happens in like the 90s and early 2000s, and there are people who really don't like those eras of comics, and I respect that. I do respect that. Respect that. But that is still Superman, and this is still Superman. This is the Dark Age. That's what it is. Again, you can not like it, and that's fair. But I do think there are times when you need to shake the tree a little bit and see what falls out. There are times when you need to shake things up and try something different. And what Zack Snyder did with the Man of Steel is that. Again, he's trying to do something very, very different. And I think the movie itself is very impactful. It succeeds in its goal. It takes a different version of Superman and puts it in what is a really watchable movie, what is a good movie. I wouldn't necessarily say that it's great. There's definitely a time when I would have said that, but I wouldn't say it anymore. But it is still good, and it is still Superman. He's darker, he's grittier, but he is still filled with hope and love and compassion because that's who he is. It's still there. It's not gone. It's less prevalent, but it's there. Superman is an inherently hopeful character. Every action that he takes in this movie, except for the end, is built on hope. It's built on hope. When he surrenders himself over to General Zod, it is because he is hopeful for humanity. He is hopeful. When he gives himself up, it is because he believes that humanity has a better future. I mean, that's hope. Like, again, it's not as obvious, but to say that it's not there is just incorrect. It's just incorrect. Now, I do want to very quickly address, the culmination of the movie, the end confrontation between Superman and General Zod. They are in, I don't know, a building like a bank, or maybe it's like a municipal building or some such. But Zod is going to use his heat vision to murder a family, basically. And Superman is like, no, don't do this. He's got him in a chokehold. And to stop Zod from killing the family, he snaps his neck. I don't know how I feel about that. This is the scene that when a lot of people talk about this movie being garbage, this is the scene that they point to. I don't know how I feel about it. I can see multiple sides here. I understand that this is not necessarily a Superman thing to do per se. It's tough to talk about this because I think what would have happened in a sequel to this movie would color my perceptions of this interaction, right? So if we get Man of Steel 2 and we see Superman dealing with the fact that he did kill somebody, then I think it would be powerful. If we got to see the effects of it and how it impacts Clark, that would be something. But we don't get that. We didn't get that. We'll probably never get it. We're pretty much well past that point by now. So I don't know. It's tough to say. Again, I think it makes for a really, really great moment. And if you take this character out of the comic books, which is crazy, if you just look at this movie individually, I think it's maybe in keeping with what I think it's maybe what this Clark would do. I think it's what this Superman would do in keeping with this story, in this specific story. I don't know, though. I really, really don't know. It's one of those things where I would have liked to have seen something, and maybe there is and I missed it, but I would have liked to have, if they're going to do this at the end, I would have liked to have seen something in the beginning that sort of prefigures it. But I don't think we got that. And so in some ways, this moment does feel unearned, especially because if you're going by the comics, this is the biggest break from the character that we have, in the movie. But it's a choice for sure. By and large, I'm going to close out by saying again that this is a good movie. It has gotten a lot more hate than it really deserves in the past 5 years. In the past 5 years, everybody looks at it and tries to say that it's pure garbage. I just don't think that's true. And I think that is mostly just because it's sort of in vogue to trash on Zack Snyder, right? But the fact remains, Zack Snyder, in a lot of cases, not every case, but in a lot of cases, a good director, a good story creator. And I think it's hard to argue that he hasn't had one of the biggest impacts on the superhero movie genre. I think it's people, if you're going to talk about the people who have had the most impact on the superhero movie industry, I think you have to talk about Jon Favreau for Iron Man 1. I think you have to talk about Joss Whedon for Avengers. I think you have to talk about the Russos for specifically Infinity War and Endgame. And I think you have to talk about Zack Snyder for Watchmen and for Man of Steel. I think you have to. Watchmen and Man of Steel are both incredibly influential. Incredibly influential. There is not another superhero movie that I feel is like Man of Steel. Can you think of another superhero movie where we would see a scene where it just focuses on these tertiary characters that get like 10 total minutes of screen time? I mean, there's a scene where we just focus on Steve Lombard, Perry White, and the other worker at the Daily Planet, whose name I can't remember and I can't really find fast. This is really going to bother me. Jenny, I think it is. Jenny, played by Rebecca Buller. They get like 10 minutes of screen time. I mean, Perry gets 10 minutes of screen time. Steve Lombard and Jenny get like 30 seconds. And we have a whole scene which looks at how this massive fight between these gods is playing out in Metropolis, the impacts of it, how it affects the average everyday person. And I think it's really strong. Again, I don't know if you have a scene like that in another superhero movie. He's very influential for good or for ill, right? And so you can dislike the movies, you can hate what happened with the DCEU after this. Completely fair, completely understandable. I'd probably agree with you in a lot of cases. But Zack Snyder is important in the overall picture of the superhero genre. And I think that's just all there is to say. The movie is good. If you haven't seen it, then I think it's worth it for sure. Again, it is a good, fun movie to watch. It's a great modern superhero movie. A little too modern in some aspects, again, with the fact that it goes in a little darker route. But I think it holds up well. Almost a decade and a half later, I think it holds up, and I think it's worth a rewatch, for sure. But that is where we're going to leave it. Again, comment down below. Let me know what you think of this movie. I'm really curious to see what the general perception is these days. But yeah, let me know. And let's see, let me look at the calendar here. Thursday, we are going to be back to talk about the second volume of Joshua Williamson's ongoing Superman series, The Chained. And then Tuesday, we're going to shift a little bit, talking a little bit less Superman, and we're going to talk about Jurassic World. Shade and I are doing a review going through the whole second trilogy before the new movie releases. So make sure that you hit the notifications bell so you don't miss those episodes, and I will see you guys on Thursday.